but it could be anybody. The queue, I'm going to do it on the queue that I'm on now. That's what nil means, but I could say NS operation main queue or some other queue even. But I'm going to say nil, which means whatever queue I'm on right now when this is being executed. Using block. So I'm going to double click here to put a block. Okay, and then that's the end of that. And what's going to be in this block? This is one line of code. Self.managedObjectContext equals this notification, its user info, photo database context. Okay? Sorry for the very, very long line there. Maybe it'll fit. Yeah, it will. Okay? So I'm getting this block gets executed whenever this radio station broadcasts. And because I put that user info of the context, now I have the context. And I just set my own managed object context, and voila, it's going to load this table. Question about that? So that's notifying both on posting and receiving. All right, so now hopefully it'll work. Let's go take a look at this. And there it is. Okay? Now, it went really fast there because it actually did the load last time, but we just didn't see it. So the database was loaded. So I'm going to show you what it looked like to load up. Okay? So how do I clean this out? Okay, how do I clean my database out? And you're really going to want to know this, so really watch this. Okay? If you want to get rid of your database, especially if you want to change its schema, because if you change its schema and then you relaunch, it's going to say incompatible database type. So if you want to get rid of it, just press the home key. Well, I also recommend quitting in Xcode first. Then press the home key. Hold down, press to hold. You can do this on your device too. And then you get these jigglies, and then press the X to delete that application. And that will delete the entire application, including the database. And now, when I launch again in Xcode, it is going to start up blank, doing the flicker fetch in the background. When that managed object context is filled out with data, it magically, automatically appears in the table view. That's because that fetch results controller is watching the context. Okay? Questions?
Where did you set the user info in the managed object context?
Yeah, let's go back and look at that. The question is, where did I set that user info? This little user info right here, where did I set that? And that was when I posted the notification here in my app delegate, which I did when I set the context, which I did when I launched. Right? So I launch. Here's launching. When I launch, I create the context. You're going to create it with UI managed document. I set it right here. This is the setter for that. Okay, I set it. Then I post it to available to everybody else. Okay? Question?
How can you make sure that the view controller subscribes to the notification before it's posted by the app delegate?
Yeah, so the question is, how can I make sure that the view controller exists and is listening in time to hear this? Because the application delegate is posting this pretty early, right after launch. It's sending out this notification. And the answer to that is, that's why I do this in awake from nib, really early in the view controller's life cycle, right, when it's first created, so that it has a maximum chance of getting it. But it's possible, it's unlikely, but it's possible that some view controller you might create later in time might need it. And in that case, you might need a different mechanism, or you might need to repost, or you might need to pass it along. Okay, a lot of times we don't want to use this mechanism to give the context to view controllers exactly because the view controller doesn't exist yet. And so when this availability happens, it's not even there. So there are other ways to pass your managed object context around, and you always want to use those before a way like this. Okay, and I mentioned that in the hints of their homework is, pass the managed object context to a view controller that's NS fetch results controller controlled in a sensible way, in a way that makes sense. If you're segueing to it, pass it to it by preparing it, right? You wouldn't want to rely on something like this. Okay. All right, now let's talk about loading our database some more. Okay, right now we only loaded our database on launch. Here's application did finish launching with options. We load our database right here and start flicker fetch. That's it. Okay, well, that's not very good. That just means we only get one batch of data ever when we launch our app. We have to quit our app and relaunch it all the time. So what about kind of loading this flicker information in the background? And we can do that, but there's really two different background conditions to consider. One is background and our app is in the background. In other words, the user is not currently using our app. Okay? They were using it, but now it's in the background. Okay? How do I fetch when that happens? Well, fetching there is kind of limited by the system. The system's not going to let you just go hog wild fetching things when you're not the app that the user is using, but it'll let you do it sometimes. Okay? And the way you can get the system to kind of wake you up and let you fetch sometimes in the background every once in a while, I don't know, a few times a day, who knows what, but sometimes, is using background fetching, which is a multitasking API, new for iOS 7. And so I'm just going to show you this as an example of what some of the multitasking APIs look like. Now the way you turn this on is you edit your project. You see this is my project I clicked on up here. And now you're going to go to this tab right here, Capabilities. So I go to Capabilities, and there's a lot of capabilities. This really kind of gives you a feeling of how we're only skimming the surface of iOS when you look at all these things you can do. But anyway, we're going to do this one right here, background modes, and I'm going to turn this on. When I turn it on, there's all kinds of background modes, things that I can be allowed to do in the background. That is to say, when my app is not currently being used by the user. And I'm going to pick this one down here, background fetch. And if I turn this on, okay, background fetch, then I will occasionally, by the system, at its discretion, send a message to my app delegate, perhaps even launching me to do it. Okay? And what is that message that gets sent? I'll show it to you right here. It is called, we're going to type it in, application. So you can look at all the things you can receive from your application. There is just a billion of them here. See them? Okay? So we'll cover some of those, but not all of them, but there's quite a few of them in here. But the one you get when you do this is this one right here, perform fetch with completion handler. Okay? So this gets sent to you, and it's basically saying, okay, I'm giving you an opportunity to go do something in the background, a fetch or whatever you want to do. Usually it's a fetch, but you can kind of do whatever you want here. And the only responsibility you have in doing this is to call this completion handler when you're done. That's the only thing you absolutely have to do. If you don't call that in a timely manner, the system will grow tired of you, and it will stop fetching. It'll stop sending you this message. So the more timely you respond to this, the more likely it's going to let you fetch in the background. Okay? So what are we going to do in here? Well, turns out all we're going to do in here is start a Flickr fetch. And then we're immediately going to call this completion handler. Now, we're not done. This fetch, we just started it. It's going to take a while to come back later, but we're done as far as this background fetch thing is continued. Okay? Getting the results and doing all that, that's going to happen at some other time. But here, we're done. And we have to, the argument to this completion handler is a UI background fetch result, which is whether whatever you did in here changed your UI. Because if it did, we need to update the little task switcher. Okay, does everyone know what the task switcher is in iOS 7? It looks like this. Okay, here's the task switcher. It lets you go through and look at various apps. None of my apps are doing anything here. Let's launch an app. Let's launch Safari here. Okay, so now I go in the task switcher, and here's Safari. See how it's showing me what's actually in Safari? It's not really showing me what's in Safari right now. It's kind of showing me Safari the last time I left Safari. Or if I get this background fetch and in this completion handler I say UI background fetch new data, then it would redraw that thing for me. It would give me a chance to redraw it. But I don't actually have any new data. I have no data here because I haven't gotten the data from this yet. This Flickr fetch has not come back yet. So it's not going to do anything. Okay? So this is great. This lets me occasionally fire off a background fetch. But when the data comes back in, then what do I do? Well, if I'm in the background, none of these URL things are going to get called. Okay? Because I'm backgrounded. Now, it's not strictly true that these won't get called, because what will happen is, if the URL returns while I'm in the background, so I started it in the background, if it returns, I'll get another application thing called application handle events for background URL session. Okay? And it also has a completion handler, a little different one. Okay? So this is called whenever things happen in the background. Now what's interesting about this one is I don't actually need to do anything in this one either, because if I implement this method, then these delegate methods down here will automatically get called. And they already know how to, unpackage the data from Flickr and put it in my database. They already know how to do all that. But I still do have this responsibility for the completion handler on this one too. Okay? Now, this completion handler, we really do want to wait to call it until we've actually handled this URL coming back from Flickr. Okay, this is handling a URL coming back from Flickr. So now we're going to wait. So I'm going to have to hold on to it. So I have an instance variable here where I'm going to hold on to this completion handler. Here's the instance variable right here. Okay, it's a void, takes no arguments, just a property. All blocks, by the way, want to be copy properties. Blocks need to be copied into the heap when you keep a handle to them. Just something to know. So anyway, all I need to do is keep this thing, and then I need to call this when I'm done. So I have a method down here that I used to do that with. It's called Flickr download tasks might be complete, because I might have multiple download tasks happening. And so what I do here is I get all the tasks that my Flickr download session is doing. That's what this method does. And it has a little block that gets called because it can't do that immediately. Sometimes it takes a little time to figure that out. And then if there are no download tasks left, right, not download task count, then I'm going to call this completion handler, this Flickr download background completion handler, and say that I'm done. Okay, so now I have finished downloading it. I've redrawn my UI, and I'm calling the completion handler. And this completion handler doesn't have the little UI no data thing, because it always assumes that you're going to update your UI. Okay, so it's always assuming it's always going to redraw when you do that. Okay, so let's see what this looks. Okay, to see what this is going to look like, there's a really cool way to do. Well, let's do this two-part here. All right, I'm going to run this. Here it is right here. You can actually simulate fetching in the background in Xcode. So I'm going back to Xcode. Here's my UI. Okay, I'm going to say from Xcode under debug, simulate background fetch, and watch what's going to happen in my UI. Whoop! I got put in the background. Okay, and it's doing a fetch. It's going in Flickr, it's downloading to Flickr and doing all that stuff. And actually, if I went like this, when it was done, I would see the results in here. Okay, now that's hard for you to see here, so I'm going to show you another way to simulate a background fetch besides this. So let's delete Photomania so that our tables are empty. You'll really be able to see it clearly here. Oops, should have quit Xcode first. Hopefully I didn't mess it up. And so what I'm going to do here is there's a way to launch your application as if it just got launched from a background fetch. And the way you do that is edit scheme. If you edit this little scheme, the scheme is how it's launching you. In this case, it's launching it in a simulator. So if you edit scheme and you go over to options, there's this little switch here, launch due to a background fetch. In other words, when I hit run, pretend I just got launched because a background fetch got sent to me. Okay? So that's what that means. Now, normally we're not going to set that switch and leave it set like that. You can actually duplicate this scheme. So I have a scheme, I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to call it my BFF scheme. That means background Flickr fetcher. Okay, it's my BFF scheme. And in my BFF scheme, I'm going to have that switch set. Okay, in my other scheme, if I go back to this scheme and edit it, that switch is not set. Okay, so if I want to, pretend that's happening, I go to my BFF scheme and I press run. Now, when I run, see, it ran me in the background. So the other two things, or the other thing I really wanted to show you here, which I don't really have time to